So, good evening from Boston College. I am Jim Keenan. Um, I teach here at Boston College, and I wish you all a happy Juneteenth. I welcome you to the show at 6, BC and the Common Good. The show at 6 features friends and members of the BC community discussing a range of issues affecting our world today, all revolving around the theme of the common good. Topics include how the BC community is responding to the effects of COVID-19, to the enduring challenges of the marginalized, to our own resiliency and solidarity, to the upbuilding of human dignity and throughout the world. The show is based on the central insight of the common good, that is, that the resources that humanity has and needs must be shared equitably. For instance, today, each of us is called to promote the common good by social distancing, by wearing masks, by washing our hands. These practices, like other forms of solidarity, are not only for our own good, but for the common good. Let me just give you one little set of directions. At 6:40, my co-host Luke Murphy and I will ask our guests questions from the audience, from you. Members of the audience can pose a question before 6:40 p.m. via the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. Let me repeat that members of the audience can pose a question before 6:40 p.m. via the Q&A button at the bottom of their screen. They should identify themselves by their name and their relationship to BC. Now let me introduce to you my co-host, Luke Murphy. A recent graduate of Boston College, where he majored in biology and minored in theology. He has been interested in working with people experiencing homelessness since high school. While at BC, Luke served at the Boston Healthcare for the Homeless program through the For Boston Volunteers program. He has been involved in service at Haley House and the East Boston Neighborhood Health Center. He was director of community education and an EMT on campus through the Boston College Emergency Medical Service. He has a strong interest in research. He worked as an undergraduate research assistant in a cell and developmental biology lab on campus. And after a semester studying in Quito, he spent 2 summers conducting public health research, first in Cuernavaca and then in Pretoria. Next year, he will be working at a community health center in Wisconsin through the Jesuit Volunteer Corps. Afterwards, he hopes to attend medical school and pursue a career as a physician working to promote health equity. Welcome, Luke.
Thanks.
I just want to say to everybody, I'm very excited about this evening's show. 2 of my all-time heroes are on this show, Jim O'Connell and Roseanne Haggerty. And I got to know Roseanne in Rome, where we were at a conference on homelessness that a mutual friend of ours, Mark McCreevy, hosted for about 35, 40 of us. And we spent 3.5 days there talking about homelessness, and meeting Roseanne was really a high point. So I'm very happy that she's here at BC to participate in this show at 6. She is the president and chief executive officer of Community Solutions. She is an internationally recognized leader in developing innovative strategies to end homelessness and strengthen communities. Community Solutions' large-scale change initiatives include the 100,000 homes and Built for Zero campaigns to end chronic and veteran homelessness, and neighborhood partnerships that bring together local residents and institutions to change the conditions that produce homelessness. Earlier, she founded Common Ground Community, a pioneer in the design and development of supportive housing and research-based practices that end homelessness. Ms. Haggerty is a MacArthur Foundation Fellow, a Ashoka Senior Fellow, Schwab Foundation Social Entrepreneur, and the recipient of honors including the Jane Jacobs Medal for New Ideas and Activism from the Rockefeller Foundation, Cooper Hewitt Smithsonian Design Museum's National Design Award, and Independent Sector's John W. Gardner Leadership Award. Luke?
And to introduce our other guest tonight, Dr. James O'Connell is the president of the Boston Healthcare for the Homeless program and an assistant professor of medicine at Harvard Medical School. Dr. O'Connell graduated summa cum laude from the University of Notre Dame in 1970 and received his master's degree in theology from Cambridge University in 1972. After graduating from Harvard Medical School in 1982, he completed a residency in internal medicine at the Massachusetts General Hospital. And in 1985, Dr. O'Connell began full-time clinical work with homeless individuals as the founding physician of the Boston Healthcare for the Homeless program, which now serves over 13,000 homeless persons each year in 2 hospital-based clinics and in more than 60 shelters and outreach sites in the greater Boston area. Additionally, with his colleagues, Dr. O'Connell established the nation's first medical respite program for homeless persons. Dr. O'Connell has received numerous awards, including the Albert Schweitzer Humanitarian Award in 2012, the Trustees Medal at the bicentennial celebration of the Massachusetts General Hospital in 2011. He has published articles in the New England Journal of Medicine, the Journal of the American Medical Association, the American Journal of Public Health, and several other medical journals. Dr. O'Connell has collaborated with homeless programs in many cities across the US and across the globe, including Los Angeles, London, and Sydney. Finally, Dr. O'Connell's book, Stories from the Shadows, Reflections of a Street Doctor, was published in 2015 to celebrate the 30th anniversary of the Boston Healthcare for the Homeless program. Welcome.
So it's good to have you both here with us this evening, and we're just going to jump right into the questions, if that's okay. So I had the first question, and when we first conceived this show for this evening, we thought of Jim giving the local Boston Healthcare for the Homeless and Roseanne giving the general view through Community Solutions. But the more we descended into the particulars of the program, we found that both are very local. In particular, by Community Solutions Built for Zero project, you insist on knowing each homeless person by name. Could you each tell us why it is so important in your specific projects to know each homeless person by name? And I know, Jim, that you do this because Luke told me you do this. So the question is for both of you.
Well, I can start, and just let me say how thrilled I am to be here, and anything that Jim O'Connell is involved with, I'm just honored to also be part of the discussion. But in our work, which involves currently assisting 81 cities and counties across the United States in the Built for Zero collaborative, we see knowing every individual by name as both an ethical commitment and a strategic necessity. And maybe it would be helpful for me to describe a little bit about what we've learned about really the nature of problem solving homelessness. Built for Zero stands for where all of these communities are moving together toward a sustainable end to homelessness that essentially looks like a sustainable end to any public health crisis, where most of the energy is on prevention, that if there is a problem and people experience homelessness, it's quickly identified and properly and quickly resolved, that's a state of functional zero that all of these communities have signed up to work on together. And what we learned over many years, seeing what it would take to not simply respond to homelessness, but really get to root causes and have a community-wide system that got to that result, we found that without knowing by name in real time who was actually experiencing homelessness, communities were just kind of doing their best to provide services, but weren't really understanding the dynamics of the problem, weren't understanding the individual diagnoses, what had led each individual into homelessness, and what would the most acceptable, sustainable pathways be out of homelessness. And this is a bit of I think a perfect handoff to Jim, but what we have come to see more and more across all of these communities, and collectively in the last 5 years, they've housed more than 117,000 long-term homeless, chronically homeless individuals and homeless veterans. But what they found is that this is so like good health care, that you need an individual diagnosis. You need to know what's going on with that person to be able to begin solving not just their challenges and getting those individuals into a stable home, but this is also, interestingly, the key to solving the whole population problem across a community. That if you want to actually know how your system is moving and changing and whether you're doing things that work, you have to know in the particular, and you have to know in the general, and you have to know at the same time. But Jim, how would you answer that?
Thanks, Roseanne. And I probably would answer by starting with telling everyone how thrilled I am to be here. And Jim and Luke, I also feel the same about Roseanne. And I can tell you stories about how I met Roseanne when she had converted the Times Square Hotel into the most remarkable thing I had ever seen, all for homeless people. But and then the other thing I have to apologize for, I let a dermatologist get in my face today, so please don't be worried about all of this, okay? If you saw it in real life, it'd be even worse. When I started, I came right out of the hospital, headed to the shelters knowing nothing about it. This is back in the mid-'80s. And I got sort of collared by Barbara McGinnis, who was a nurse at Pine Street Inn. She was kind of a closet Catholic worker, and she was a third order San Franciscan, by the way. I always wore sandals. But when I started, they sat me down, the nurses in the clinic sat me down and said, if you expect anything to happen in the life of a homeless person, you have to remember that their lives are marked by fragmentation, loss, and lack of continuity. And if you want to be their doctor, then you're going to have to establish some sort of continuity. So our version of getting to know names was, Barbara made me so, the Pine Street nurses were phenomenal. If you've never seen it, that we still do it at St. Francis House, but they soak people's feet. That's how you get to know them. And people are pretty, it's a long way from the personal space. If you're soaking somebody's feet, it's got a lot of biblical significance. But in fact, it's just a very soothing act of service. But I had to spend 2 months. I couldn't do any doctoring for the first 2 months I started. I had to soak feet. In fact, Barbara stole my stethoscope, put it away in a drawer, and I couldn't be a doctor. I had to be soaking feet. And I learned a lot then. And it was exactly what Roseanne said. If you're really going to make a difference in somebody's life, get to care for them in some way, they have to trust you. You have to be consistent. You have to have a cup of coffee with them. You have to do all the things that I think professional boundaries I had been taught not to pass over. So I have, in our program, I think the one-to-one relationship, the trusting relationship is the core of what we do. And many things are possible if you have that. If you don't have that relationship, almost nothing is possible. So let me stop it there. But I agree completely with Roseanne.
So let me take it a little bit further. When I was a boy in Brooklyn growing up, all the kids in the neighborhood, we used to tease and taunt this one homeless man. And so this would have been in the late 50s, early 60s. And to us, he was completely anonymous. We didn't know who he was, but he was just an object of derision, childish derision. Years later, I moved out with my family to Long Island. I was in high school. And one day my father, who was a police officer, said to me that the homeless man who had lived in our neighborhood had died. And I was surprised how my father would know that this homeless man died in Brooklyn, in our old neighborhood, that he knew something about him. And so I said, well, how do you know him? And he said, he was the grandfather of your best friend. And that really threw me. It took me a long time to wrap that man had a family. And I had always thought he was completely anonymous. He had no relations. I just thought he was an isolated individual. And I was thinking when I see, like Built for Zero and what the Boston Healthcare for the Homeless do in terms of knowing the name of each of the people that they're working with, I was wondering about the families of these homeless people. Do you, when you know a homeless person by name, do you get to meet their family? Do you get to know their family? You mentioned just a moment ago about a lack of continuity, about the other challenges that are going on. Where's the family in the work that you do with people who are unhoused?
Well, I'd just like to lift up your point, Jim, about anonymity and this seeming to characterize the lives of people experiencing homelessness. And it's so true. And one of the things that is very linked to this insight that you need to know people by name in order to change not the trajectory of their lives, but the whole trajectory of homelessness in a community, is this insight that we in the communities we work with came to, that it's anonymity that kills. It's anonymity that allows the fragmentation. If we don't know people's name, then somehow we can avoid accountability. And what we learned, and this is going back to the days of our 100,000 Homes campaign, which went from 2010 to 2014, was, and it involved getting groups of community volunteers to do, like as a starting point, a registry, like a public health registry of everyone experiencing homelessness, and getting the details of their story. That we saw the huge transformation happen in those volunteers and in the community agencies, that all of the people would come back, like often in tears, saying, I just had a conversation with this 25-year-old young woman under a bridge. She could have been my niece. And once it becomes a person with a story, with a history, the urgency of solving the problem, of kind of dealing with that fragmentation, getting out of the way of what needs to be done, that is really catalyzed by stripping the anonymity away. What I will say is that very occasionally in my work, when we've been working with people directly on the street, do family members come into play. But what is so powerful is once people are in a stable place, there is very frequently, they feel able to reconnect with families, or there's a sense of they're in a place where they are prepared to be known again. And that is such a powerful shift to a place of without shame, to a place of dignity and stability. And that is often marked by reconnection with family.
Thank you. Jim?
Family for us, of course, becomes very important, because if you're doing the healthcare for someone, then you really want to know that if anything happens, is someone you can call and rely on. So the question about family comes up often for us, and it's been frankly all over the place. There are some people for whom whatever happened, it's made it impossible for them to reconnect to their families. And we have often learned of families that have exhausted everything they can and it didn't work. And so there is a fracture that we cannot fix. But then there are other people who are really lost to their families. Their families are desperately looking for them. And just as Roseanne pointed out, frequently when either they come into the hospital and we're taking care of them for something that is relatively serious, connecting to the family becomes really important. And have a stable place to be where they can actually call and have their families come visit. It's quite remarkable. But we've been pretty struck by how all over the place it is, to be honest with you, that there are some families that have really said, this has been too much for us, and they've said no, and others where they're desperate to get to know one. I can give you one example of, and this would be a New Yorker, by the way, just for those of you from Brooklyn and Long Island. A man that I had known on the streets for 10 years, and he didn't want to tell us anything about himself, except that he used to teach at Columbia University. He would tell us that. To make a very long story short, he had been at the age of 16 teaching English at Columbia, and he was a very close friend of several of the Beat Generation people. He knew about Van Dorn and people that you wouldn't know about unless you really had done some philosophy. So he knew Trilling. And when we finally got him in, he got very sick. He was in his late 70s, got him in to the hospital, and we're moving up to a nursing home. We were able to connect to his family, who did not know where he had been for the last 50 years. And his 84-year-old sister and her family came up and reunited with him in the nursing home. And it was one of the more stunning things. I know that his family never gave up on him. They just knew he was lost somewhere on the streets. He never used his real name, so no one could connection. So when that happens, you feel like there's that something good has happened, and the person can have some degree of peace and less loneliness. Because I would, add to what Roseanne said, that the enemy for us is real loneliness. The poverty on the streets is not only a, an abject poverty about money and things, but it's a loneliness. And I can certainly tell you I've worked at times in Africa and in Haiti, and I've seen poverty like I've never seen before. But when people were sick and came to the hospital, they came with their families and there were kids running around, and there seemed to be, at least in the poverty, some community. But for many of our folks, particularly those who end up on the streets, they are about as lonely as anyone you know. So it's a very lonely poverty. And I think one of the goals of everything I've ever watched Roseanne and her staff do and our own is how do you address the loneliness, which turns out to be medically very dangerous.
Thank you. Thanks. Luke?
Yeah, maybe to take a step back and look a little more broadly at both of your sort of vocational paths. We recognize that you guys come to the field with different backgrounds and different areas of expertise. You know, Dr. O'Connell, your work at the Boston Healthcare for the Homeless program is of course focused in the greater Boston area and specifically in providing quality healthcare to folks experiencing homelessness. And Roseanne, your work at Community Solutions takes you to communities all across the country. And so I'd love to know how you first got involved in the type of work. Dr. Connell, you talked about this a little bit earlier, and then also how you see your specific role or area of expertise fitting into like the larger project of addressing and ending homelessness in the US.
Well, I grew up in the Hartford area in a family really steeped in Catholic social teaching and walking the talk. And right after college, volunteered for a year at a shelter for runaway and homeless young people in Times Square in New York. And I intended that to be just a one-year detour, but was very sort of captured by the fact that shelter is not the answer. And these are the early days of kind of modern mass homelessness, and how the young people I was responsible for, all they wanted to talk about was, did I have any ideas about how they could get housing? And like we had all sorts of other ideas for them. They actually were focusing on the right thing. How do I begin building a stable life? And so that was my first kind of entry point. I worked as an affordable housing developer, and the first organization I started was strictly about building housing, called permanent supportive housing for those experiencing homelessness and the working poor. And it was really by understanding that while housing is a critical ingredient, we were building more and more housing in and around New York, but homelessness was going up. And so there was this reckoning of, are we here to build more and operate more good programs, or is there something missing that we all have to own collectively, which is how do we put all of these fragmented pieces together and start with the person, know by name, on the street, and work back from the end state we want, which is zero homelessness. And so our work it actually led to our starting a new organization specifically to work with communities on putting that whole system together. So that's been the through line for me.
And Luke, I hope you will forgive me for coming from Notre Dame and not BC, but I wanted to, so I graduated, just to give you an awful statistic. So I graduated 50 years ago this month, at a time when the Kent State killings had occurred. There were 4 students who were killed by the National Guard at Kent State. And so all of our graduations were canceled back 50 years ago. And then we tried to have a reunion. We were really looking forward to getting together. And now, for other reasons, our reunion was canceled this year. So I feel bookended by cancellations. But coming out of the 60s, what you kindly didn't do is talk about the years between, college and graduate school. And by the time I got to medical school. So my mother, while she was still alive, would not have let me talk about that time publicly. So I'll spare all of you that. But when I finally got to medical school, and I was in my 30s, so I was really anxious and happy to find something I wanted to do. I wanted to become, because I ended up in Boston, I wanted to become a specialist. I was going to become an oncologist. And in truth, just as Roseanne said, I also hit one of those strange detours where a doctor named Tom Durant, who is, by the way, a very fanatic BC person on the board at BC, had been involved with the city of Boston, Mayor Flynn, in getting a grant from the Robert Johnson Foundation to start up a homeless program to try to take care of the medical and other needs of homeless people who at that time were deluging the emergency rooms. So I got conscripted. I got called into my chief of medicine's office. And instead of going to New York City, where I was going to go for a oncology fellowship, which is what I really wanted to do, they asked me to do just what Roseanne did, do 1 year of this sort of what I thought of as urban Peace Corps. How could I say no? You know, it was the perfect thing to do. So I went there to do it for a year. And it was too compelling and too hard and too confusing. And the answers seemed to be many years away. So I stuck with it, and that's how I get there. So I wish I could give you a linear path, but it was really serendipity, for which I'm now very grateful.
Thank you. And I guess moving towards what's currently happening in the world right now, in light of the sort of demonstrations and protests that have occurred across the country the past couple of weeks after the murder of George Floyd by Minneapolis police, and then also today being Juneteenth, you know, the day that commemorates the end of slavery in the US, we wanted to ask you guys a little bit about the intersection of race and homelessness. And just a quick stat, the National Alliance to End Homelessness reports that African Americans in the US make up 40% of the homeless population and 13% of the total population. So there's definitely a disparity in the rates of homelessness along racial lines. So how do you both see racism, and maybe particularly structural racism, having an impact on homelessness and homeless individuals?
Well, the events of recent weeks, and also what COVID-19 exposed as far as the vulnerabilities of people of color, just really put in stark relief something that has been visible but not really centered in discussions of homelessness over the many years. As you quoted, Luke, we know these statistics that particularly African American and Native American individuals are far more likely to experience homelessness. I mean, at multiples. In fact, one of the most jarring moments of my work must have been 15, possibly closer to 20 years ago. I was asked to meet with a group of people visiting from other countries, and the New York City shelter operating system had invited me along, and I was escorting this group to the vast men's shelter in Manhattan at Bellevue, adjacent to the hospital there. And one of the individuals on the tour asked me through a translator, "Where is the shelter for white people?" So this has been in plain sight for a long time, that homelessness disproportionately touches the lives of African American and Native American people in particular. The structural factors are also too evident when we look at the pathways into homelessness. So there is such a significant overlap between the foster care system, the criminal justice system, long-standing poverty and housing instability. And when you look at who is experiencing those systems, it's overwhelmingly people of color. And I'll also say another piece of this is, and we're getting at this more and more as we help communities get close to zero, we see that things like segregationist housing policies, lack of enforcement of fair housing laws, lack of enforcement of basic housing codes are all contributing to the housing instability and the slowness of helping people move out of homelessness. Our team has been working for the last year with our communities to develop and test a racially equitable homelessness response system set of measures so that we can begin pulling apart the data at each step of the journey and help communities that are really determined to erase homelessness know how these racially biased systems are keeping this issue stuck and burdening people of color.
Yeah, and I find this a particularly painful time. it has been very clear to us all along, although I don't think we ever articulated it as clearly as we should have, that racist things, whether conscious or unconscious, whether structural or just overt, have really played an important and devastating role for homeless folks. And we're seeing that play out, you know, the statistics you quoted about the number of the 13%, but 40% of the thing are exactly the statistics we're seeing when you look at COVID. Of, you know, that percentage of the people in a town are but then 40% of the deaths are due to that. So it is really ingrained and deep. And you know, this is Juneteenth, and I've been thinking a little bit about, you know, if I can go back up, forgive me for being like an old guy here, but you know, that time in college was very heady for us. It was the civil rights movement. You know, I was a junior when Reverend Martin Luther King died. He had been at Notre Dame often because Father Hesburgh, the head of Notre Dame, was also the first head of the U.S. Civil Rights Commission, and he was very close with. And we thought we were marching, we were doing all the things, and we got the laws changed. And we sort of celebrated that, thinking we were finally getting to a country we could really like. And now I'm looking 50 years later. Did anything really change? We changed the laws, but we didn't really change anybody's hearts. And we've all been now 50 years ensconced in this system of which we're all a part now. So I think in our program, we've been trying very hard to just have the open discussions. And we realize that those of us who are old and white have to just listen now. We have to figure out what is it that needs to be done. So I think I'm cautiously optimistic that at long last, hearts are going to have to follow the law in some way, and we'll keep hoping to see what will change on this. But it is, the more we look into it, the more devastating it is to realize how much unconscious racism is in each of us, you know, that we don't even know we're participating in. So I think we've got a lot of learning to do.
I have, I'm only going to ask one question before Luke asks a question, but I wanted to ask you about another group that is disproportionately represented in the homeless population. That's the LGBTQ plus community. It's estimated that up to 40% of homeless youth identify as LGBTQ plus. What impact does queerness have on homelessness? And have your organizations done work to help queer folks experiencing homelessness?
As you point out, Jim, it's most pronounced in the homeless youth domain. And we work with two organizations, Away Home America and Away Home Washington, state of Washington, that is, to help build parallel movements to Built for Zero, but in the youth homelessness space. And in both cases, those organizations have specifically foregrounded the intention of zero homelessness among LGBTQ youth and youth of color. And so we think that certainly, you know, the interventions in this way of getting everyone in a community together around this commitment, being really accountable for the results, focusing on the most vulnerable, this is a way to move the needle. But certainly the work of preventing homelessness in this space, it's just at the outset.
Yeah.
It has been for about 15 years now a major issue for us as well. And what we started to realize, we have a respite program where there's 104 beds for people who are either coming out of the hospital or should go to the hospital but don't have a home to go to be cared for. And when there was, I remember, never forget, there was a trans woman who came. And the question is, where would she go? To the men's side, because she was phenotypically still male, or does she go to the women's side? And there was a huge uproar about it. What do you do? Not among ourselves, but among our patients. So we started a clinic, believe it or not, about 15 years ago for, it was a transgender clinic. We learned everything we could. We had several of our friends from the hospital who were specialists come over, and we thought we might serve 10 or 15 people. And within about a month, we had 50 homeless people who were in the process of transitioning. or wanting to transition. And it's a very complicated world. And we used to do the clinic on a night, we'd close our building down, our main building down, do the clinic on a Thursday night when it was safe for everybody. And it was kind of festive, but it was perfectly safe. People could come out and be who they wanted to be. So we were very proud of that. But within about a year, I would say, that clinic sort of, even though it continued, most of those people then started just coming to our regular clinics because it was beginning to get accepted. And one of those folks is now one of our consumer members on our board of directors. So, one of our most vocal board members is a trans woman who is homeless still herself, and she has led the hospital across the street in its transgender efforts. And so we actually feel a little bit better now about making sure we've involved the people who are serving in that. And boy, have they taught us a lot, because this is the kind of thing we didn't learn a lot about in medical school. Most of the nurses knew very little about it. And we've been blessed to have people teach us do that. But I've been shocked. I think the point I would make is that where once upon a time, I think everyone felt that was, shocking. Now it's just seen as routine. And I've never seen it happen quite that quickly. I wish we could do that with race as well.
Thank you.
Thank you both. Yeah. So I think the final question that we want to ask before we open up to audience, sort of about what you guys think, or what you see the future of your work and issues to address homelessness going forward. Because we know, looking post-COVID, there's a lot of people who are eager to get back to normal. And then there's obviously a big push of people saying the normal that we had has sort of, the coronavirus has brought to light a lot of problems with our society and our economy, that should be fixed, and we should have a new normal. And similarly, with the strength of the current Black Lives Matter movement, I think there's also hope for a new normal based on how policing is done and based on how we respond to mental health emergencies or emergencies involving substance abuse disorder, all those kinds of things. And so I was wondering how you guys see efforts to sort of address homelessness might be transformed or shifted or changed in light of what's currently happening in the world right now.
Well, my hope and belief, it certainly won't happen without an enormous commitment, but that this is the time when the fragility, if not absence, of a robust public health system in the country, of an adequate civic infrastructure, of the failure of our governance models in many areas, coupled with the confrontation with the racial inequities that just demand our for top of mind and first action attention, that this is the point where we actually should design homelessness out of existence. As we especially rebuild the public health system, homelessness and having zero homelessness, meaning it's a rare event, is a remarkably strong measure of how well your society is doing. Yeah. Who is falling through the cracks? Who is being treated inequitably? Where are the places of vulnerability? Just as we have in earlier crises, built new systems to handle the challenges of the age. I'm thinking really back more of 100 years ago, with housing codes and a public health system that essentially focused on sanitation and then vaccination. Now I think this notion of the social determinants of health, racism is a social determinant of health, homelessness certainly is, housing stability, that we should be building our systems now that protect us all with these markers in mind, that they have to be racially equitable. We have to look at homelessness as both a preventable condition, and if it persists, as a warning sign that these systems are breaking down. And we have enough evidence around how you actually organize communities to solve the problem that can inform this kind of new design.
You know, Luke, I struggle with this. I depend on Roseanne to give me my inspiration. What we find a lot is, and we've learned this certainly through COVID, and now with the with the lens, the newer lens of really racial issues going on. It's pretty clear that this is a poignant moment in time, and maybe we can do something, and that maybe this is a tipping point. I worry though about whether people are ready to tackle it. That's what I fear. I think we're ready to, when we take care of, people with cancer, people that we can sort of get everything together and take care of them. But when we look at the real social determinants of their health, it goes back to their bad foster care and to the fact they had a terrible education in an inner city school, grew up in a world that was full of drugs and crime, and they never had a chance. So their health was determined 40 years ago by institutional, real cruelty. And I think if we're going to stop this in the long run, we have to acknowledge we're all in this. This is not, whereas I'm like, as a doctor and as a human being, I am passionate that housing should be a fundamental right of everybody, whether it costs money, saves money, whatever. Everybody should have their own house. That's the moral side. But I also know that housing alone, as Roseanne would say, is the fundamental thing you need, but you also need an awful lot of support. And you need good schools, you need safe neighborhoods, you need, as we're learning with COVID, you need to not be crowded, because even if you have really good, if really you're in a place with a lot of other people, you're still going to get COVID. So you need all of the things that we've now got to get together as a system and do. And maybe we're almost ready to do that. But I want to get this, the education folks involved, the legal folks involved, public health and health, I think is starting to get there. Housing has always been there, but we've got to bring them all together. The correction system, how do we get them to look at this as a new issue? And when I see the economy needing, trillions of dollars infused to fix it, maybe we can look at, there are some major social problems that may need a couple $1 trillion to be infused and have it happen. But I truly and honestly don't think that's going to happen until we really all do get together and see this as a societal problem, not a health problem or only a public health problem or only a housing problem. I think it's much more than that.
Great, thank you guys. And I think, we'll start transitioning to questions from the audience. The first one is from Katie Hayward, who is Boston College class of 15 and Masters of Social Work from Boston College class of 2018. And she asks, how have you seen the needs of those experiencing homelessness evolve during your time of service?
Roseanne, do you want me to start on that? Or are you ready?
Why don't you go ahead, Jim, if you have a ready answer. I have to think about that for a moment.
Yeah, no, I think it's a very profound question. I'm not so sure I'm right. What I can certainly say is I'm looking at our own evolution, and maybe that does parallel the evolution of the people we're serving. But certainly for when we started, we were forged in the crucible of AIDS just started. So AIDS was just beginning in the early 80s, and homelessness and AIDS kind of went arm in arm. We had terrible tuberculosis at the time. So we were kind of forged in this public health issues that related to infectious diseases, much like what we're experiencing today. And the needs back then seemed to be a little bit more focused. And then as we got to understand more and more about homelessness, you started to realize that people's needs were really varied and really intense, and you needed a real armamentarium of support services and things to do. You needed to help with getting their social security checks, getting their, getting their queries, their criminal records mitigated so they could get into housing, all the stuff that we had never thought about. So I think that the needs that we see with homeless folks now pretty much parallel all the weaknesses in our social structure. And those are the things we're going to need. So I think it's a much more complicated thing now. We learned, I think, how to, we take care of about 500 people who are homeless and have AIDS, as Luke knows. And they're their viral loads are just the same as anyone going to the Mass General clinics. So we can sort of take care of AIDS when you're homeless, but we can't take care of the rest. So as we piece different parts around, we know we need to expand and understand that more. That's a very awkward answer to a very good question.
I think the two things that I might add to the question, which I, again, like Jim, think very thoughtful one, is just to observe that it is very much a local and regional phenomenon. We see in California in particular and parts of Florida that the cost of housing there, and then certainly in New York, but New York is an unusual case, that there are far more individuals and families experiencing homelessness who are also working or working in low-wage jobs. And I think to that degree, as Jim pointed out, very much mirrors things going on in the larger society and economy, that you can, the inequality gaps are so extreme now that, and they're expressed in highlighted ways in the highest cost housing markets of the country. It's not as visible where there is less inequality. The fact that there are so many working poor among the homeless, but that's been a huge change in my time doing the work. And again, as Jim pointed out, the health profile has tended to change, and will mirror whatever vulnerability happens to be in the community, whether it's different kinds of street drugs, hepatitis A. The people experiencing homelessness are just so vulnerable to whatever health risks are pervasive in a community, and those tend to have their cycles.
I'm delighted. I have a question here from a colleague of mine that I've never met except for on Zoom, but it's Takahito Kamata, professor at Sophia University in Tokyo. And he's been watching our show for a couple of occasions, and he asked, homelessness is a community problem, and it is crucial to work collectively with other stakeholders, such as public officials, churches, employers, and others. As a leader, what kinds of challenges do you have at the organizational level when you collaborate with other stakeholders across professional boundaries to provide support for homeless people? Maybe just to tweak that a little further, like what stakeholders do you find kind of surprisingly helpful?
Well, the way that we have evolved our work, as the professor hinted, in each of the communities that is an active Built for Zero community, we help them build a collaborative team, which in the United States sort of minimally must consist of local government, that could be the county or executive or the mayor's office, the coalition of not-for-profits who receive funds from the federal government to provide services to the homeless, the Veterans Administrator, or Veterans Affairs rather, the local medical center that has resources for veterans, and also the Housing Authority, which has the housing vouchers. If you can get at least those four entities understanding that they need to be a team, function as a team, be aiming their activities at the same problem, measuring it in the same way, sharing data, resources, bending whatever their own priorities are to the good of the whole community. That's where you see the progress towards zero. That basically collapsing that fragmentation through a team structure. And what has been interesting, and again, very much tracks local conditions and assets, but for example, in some of the southern states and some of the more rural areas, we've seen that those teams have stretched to include faith-based organizations, local sheriff's office, like who has the van who can go out in the woods, and it's this thinking of what are the assets in our community that can be sort of attached to this hub, which at its core is government and not-for-profit. So,
great.
And I would, I'm sort of honored to have a question from Professor Kamata in Tokyo, that's or in Japan. Um, I would, taking it on a more micro level than Roseanne, who has a much broader view, I would think of in Boston, your question resonates a lot for me. What we found is if you just look at how do you do good healthcare to a group of people that have been sort of pushed to the edge of society, you need to have vertical integration in your healthcare system. So you need to be able to reach out to wherever people are to do clinics. You need to make sure when they're sick, you can bring them in for imaging and more testing. And then when they're really sick, you have to take care of them when they're in the hospital. So that system has to be uniform and singular. And then at the same time, you have to horizontally integrate everything across the community. And that's where I think the professor's question comes in. So we've learned a long time ago, as Rosanna is saying, we have to stay very close to the mayor and the governor because we have to have their ear and say, here's what's going on. We have to have coalitions of social services, police, which is really critical, and first responders, since they're the people that often see homeless people first. And so over time, I've noticed in Boston is, at least from the health perspective, we have pretty much a single system of care for homeless people that's integrated throughout the city, and it's continuous. It's not fragmented. So that though takes years to do, which is what I would urge people to think about. That it takes a long time to build the kind of relationships that I think you probably fundamentally need to address this. And I'm just talking about the healthcare. When you then expand to making sure we do housing and better education and community work building and all of that, then you have to parlay all those relationships into a whole. But I think it's a fundamentally critical task for us to do to make sure that we are working as part of a community and not working as part of one organization.
Thank you. Luke?
Yeah, there's so many good questions in the from the audience, but unfortunately, we only have time for one more quick one. And so Liam Dietrich, who's a sophomore, rising sophomore at Boston College, asks if you could enact one reform right now to address homelessness in America, what would it be, and why would you choose that specific reform?
I think probably having a universal rental subsidy benefit would be the most powerful thing that we could achieve. Most Western democracies have this, so just to be able to support people in securing and preserving their housing.
Could you say more?
Sure. There is in the United States a program called Section 8, and there's some other rental subsidy programs that come from the federal government. Some states have fashioned their own kind of local rental subsidy programs. But simply put, it would supply the difference between what an individual or family could pay as a third of their income toward rent in a, there's a whole construction around this, a fair market rent for an area. Having government fill that gap basically takes so much stress off a family or individual. It essentially, for the most part, will help to assure that they don't become homeless, at least for financial reasons. Now, it's perceived as an expensive program in the United States. Unlike other countries, there's X amount of Section 8 subsidy, and it's like whoever are the lucky ones to get it, and it is in no way meets the need of families who are living at or below the poverty level. But there have been, well, before our present administration, there was bipartisan support for a much broader rental subsidy program in the country. And when you think of all of the other benefits that flow from having stable housing, the ability to maintain one's health, to contribute to the community, to have your children in a stable place in terms of completing school. There are many benefits for individual and society that flow from that. But in addition to that, Jim mentioned this earlier, we're now writing trillion-dollar checks in the country. This program has been costed out of expanding rental subsidies. And in fact, it wouldn't cost anything even on the same order of magnitude as the mortgage deduction tax. So, there is, a social rationale, an economic, a health rationale, a vehicle to distribute this kind of assistance, and it would be an enormous catalyst to the stability and contributions and health of many families and individuals.
Thank you.
And I would add to Liam that that's a very mean question to ask of only one thing you can do. And I would certainly subscribe to what Roseanne just said. But let me tell you what that brings up for me, that question, is we try very hard to simplify the issues so that you can have a soundbite to say, here's what needs to be done. And the example I think of is, I'm a fanatic for let's have universal healthcare. Let's make sure everybody has insurance. And we've sort of done that in Massachusetts, 97, 98% of everybody has insurance. And the lesson we learned, while that's absolutely critical, it doesn't solve the problem of health for homeless people, because having insurance doesn't mean you have access to good care that understands your particular circumstances. So learning, for every good thing you do, you have to really measure it out about how that's going to affect the people that you're. So I think, when I think of rental, having more Section 8s, having rental assistance would be great, especially if we can elevate the wage level for people. But the problem that people who are working, just think now, I think in Massachusetts we have a living wage now, but if you work 40 hours a week with a living wage, you make about $30,000 a year, and that does not allow you as a single wage earner to rent a one-bedroom apartment in Boston. You can't do it on that amount of money. So there's a real fundamental mismatch, which Roseanne was hitting. She hit all the points on that, and I subscribe to that. We have to look at the inequity in the way we look at, as we're learning in COVID for sure, at these essential jobs. And then if you were to really push me and say, what's the one thing I would do? I would pay every school teacher $150,000 to $200,000 a year, and in 40 years we would have no homelessness.
Wow. Could you say that one more time just as we end?
No, I think, there are studies from all over the world. If you do any looking into Africa or another place, the thing that correlates best with health and longevity is your education level. Right. And when we take care of our folks on the street, all of whom we've gotten to know well, 25% of them cannot read or write. They somehow got through everything in our social service network and educational network without being able to do the fundamental things they need. So I look back and really, one of the things I think is left out a lot is we really have to fix the education system if we really want to stop spitting poor kids out into the streets because they can't make it. So I think we need to elevate teachers should be the ones paid the most. And I'm thinking of primary and secondary school teachers.
So this goes now to Luke to close down the show, but I just have to thank the two of you. It's just a real pleasure to see both of you here. Thank you. Luke, it's yours.
Yeah, to wrap up again, I would just like to echo that, Jim, and say thank you to Roseanne Haggerty and Jim O'Connell for taking the time to sit down with us and share your wisdom and experience working with homeless individuals over the past number of years. It was a really enlightening conversation for me, and again, thank you guys very much. I'd also like to thank questions in his presence here tonight. Just to quickly preview our next topic, the next installment of the show at 6 will be this coming Tuesday, June 23rd. The topic will be Global Public Health, featuring Dr. Philip Landrigan, who is the director of the Program for Global Public Health and the Common Good at BC, and the director of the Global Observatory on Pollution and Health, hosted by Tara Pisana-Guro, who is an associate professor of the practice and director of the Environmental Studies program at Boston College, and Andrea Vicini of the Society of Jesus, who's a professor of moral theology and the Michael P. Walsh Professor of Bioethics. Again, that's June 23rd from 6 to 7. And one final reminder is that you do need to register individually for each segment that you want to attend. As you know, registration is quite brief, but each segment has a different webinar link. So please check out the webpage, bc.edu/show@6 to see the next segments. And while you're there, please check out the archives for all of our previous segments that have been posted. So again, thank you all very, very much. Be well, stay safe, and good night from Boston College.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank
Lou.
you.